Welcome to ChinaPower. I'm Bonnie Lin, your host, and in this podcast, we dissect critical issues underpinning China as a global power. Today, I am joined by Dr. Andrea Kendall-Taylor and Dr. Evan Medeiros. Dr. Kendall-Taylor is a senior fellow and director of the Transatlantic Security Program at the Center for a New American Security. Dr. Medeiros is the Penner Family Chair in Asia Studies in the School of Foreign Service and the Kling Family Distinguished Fellow in U.S.-China Studies at Georgetown University. Today, we'll be talking about the Putin-Xi summit, which took place just days after President Trump's trip to China. Andrea and Evan, thanks for joining me.
Happy to be here, Bonnie.
Thanks, Bonnie. Great to be here.
So before we get to talking about the summit in more detail, I did want to ask the two of you, what was the single thing that surprised you the most from the Putin-Xi summit?
I'll start. So from the perspective of Chinese foreign policy, what surprised me was how thin the summit was. It had this gave the impression of being very routine business in Chinese diplomacy. It was one day. It wasn't a state visit, even though, of course, it followed, Trump's 2-day state visit. It was long on symbolism, very, very short on substance. The joint statement relative to the past 4 joint statements going back to 2022 was pretty narrow and pretty limited. Of course, there was no deal on Power of Siberia II. And the agreements that they did sign were about people-to-people exchanges, S&T exchanges, educational exchanges, not really the stuff of hard power. So this was not sort of a banner summit in the grand arc of China-Russia relations.
Thank you. Andrea?
I don't disagree at all. And I perfectly agree with Evan. To me, I think it was a status quo summit. It was really a clear display of everything that's already working well in the Russia-China relationship. But it did, as Evan said, it fell short of moving relations forward. So to me, it was kind of a perfect picture of the current state of their relationship. They demonstrated their camaraderie, and that's important to Putin at a time when he's facing a lot of domestic challenges on the home front. They, per their typical fashion, criticized the United States and this tide of unilateral hegemony that's running rampant, as she said. They underscored how their cooperation makes them more resilient to Western pressure. Putin, wanted to highlight that all of their economic exchanges are now taking place in yuan and rubles. They criticize U.S. missile defense. So again, I think that's the headline, the banner. I guess it's surprising for just how little it delivered at a time when there's so much churn and turmoil in the world, and when you have the United States that's kind of criticizing allies bogged down in the Middle East, it could have been a time for them to double down and really present an alternative to the U.S., and they didn't do that.
So I do want to unpack a little bit of what both of you have said, how little you saw from the meeting between Putin and Xi. And maybe, Evan, I'll turn to you first. At least from the Chinese perspective, what do you think drove China to have this meeting with Putin so quickly after the Trump-Xi meeting? What message was Beijing trying to send, and what was the main goal for Beijing?
Bonnie, it's an important question. And I think first and foremost, it's important to remind listeners that 2026 is the 30th anniversary of China-Russia, the formation of the China-Russia Strategic Partnership, and the 25th anniversary of the China-Russia Treaty of Good Neighborliness and Friendly Cooperation. So, as many listeners know, if you're a communist, a Leninist, an authoritarian, or some combination of all three, you just love anniversaries, right? Anniversaries are to be celebrated. They provide a degree of regularity. And so I think that part of what drove this is celebrating the anniversaries, the fact that Putin has visited annually since 2022, or at least that's as far back as I looked, because I see that 2022 visit, the no limits, no ceiling partnership, really being a high watermark in their relationship. But of course, the timing was linked to the Trump summit as well. And so inviting Putin after the Trump summit was a way for China to demonstrate to domestic audiences and internationally the balance that it sought to maintain in its broad strategic relationships. And, to put a very fine point on it, to send the message that just because relations between China and the U.S. are now ones of constructive strategic stability, that does not take away from China-Russia relations. So I think that had to do with the sequencing of the two visits.
And just to follow up quickly, do you have a sense that looking at the Putin visit and the Trump visit, and you described the Putin meeting as not even a state visit, right? But the Trump one was one. Was there a sense from your perspective that China was prioritizing its relationship with both the United States and Russia similarly or differently? Or how do you basically look at these two meetings side by side?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think the Chinese were bending over backwards not to give the impression that they were privileging U.S.-China over China-Russia. In many ways, Putin got a lot of the same treatment, even though I think I'm correct in asserting that Putin's visit was not a state visit. Andrea may know specifically. For example, the fact that Wang Yi, who is both a state councilor and a Politburo member, met Putin at the airport. Basically, so in the state system, he's lower than Han Zheng, the vice president, who met Donald Trump. But in the party system, Wang Yi is higher. So this is sort of insider baseball. But the Chinese, I think, bent over backwards not to create the impression of unfair treatment. What I really think the Chinese were trying to do with the sequencing of these visits and in the context of other heads of state visits in 2026 is create this impression that the top leaders of the world are coming to China. That's really what the Chinese foreign policy strategy here is to, in this moment of dramatic change, as the post-Cold War era is dissolving and nobody knows what's replacing it. In this interregnum, the Chinese want to fill this strategic space with this sense of inevitability that China is at the center of international politics and all of the top leaders of the world, the American leader, the Russian leader, multiple European leaders, they're all coming to Beijing, right? And so I think if there's one impression the Chinese really want to give with this sequence of visits, it's that very point.
And Andrea, I want to bring you in. From your perspective, what do you think was Putin's main motivation for visiting China? And do you agree with what how Evan described how Russia was treated? Was there a sense on the Russian side that Putin was given equal treatment or taken care of during the trip?
Yeah, I think from Russia's perspective, it worked out fantastically that the Putin visit followed the Trump summit so closely. I guess that's one question I had is, as Trump was supposed to visit Beijing several months earlier and canceled his trip, I don't know if it was entirely choreographed that you would have had the Trump and then Putin summit so close back to back. But that is certainly, as Evan said, something that worked out to Xi's great advantage to be able to portray all these world leaders coming to Beijing. And it's certainly something that the Russians and the Russian media tried to capitalize on. I think the way it was covered in Moscow and with this kind of state-run newspapers is that Putin was the much more important partner. There was a lot of criticism of the Xi-Trump visit, that it was very low on substance. So it went a long way, I think, for Putin and the Kremlin to be able to demonstrate to the Russian public that this was a great success for Putin and that, the Putin-Xi relationship is far more important to the Chinese. So in that sense, I do think even though the meeting was low on actual substance, it was very important for Putin, who, as I said earlier, is facing a lot of domestic challenges at home, right? That on the battlefield in Ukraine, they aren't making significant progress. And what we're seeing is that the military bloggers and members of the elite are getting far more vocal in their criticism of the way that the war is being conducted. Putin is facing all sorts of economic challenges on the home front, and despite high oil prices as a result of the war in Iran, that isn't enough to entirely fix the Russian economy. And so I think Putin is looking for ways to demonstrate strength, and that meeting really checked the box. So I think it was a success. It was his 25th visit to Beijing. I think that's the other thing that the Chinese and Russians were able to kind of double down on. I think I read an anecdote that, that Trump got a tour of the leadership compound. The Chinese went to great lengths to describe kind of what a rare and privileged kind of visit that was, and that Trump had asked, who else has been here, and he responded, of course, Putin had been there. So I think there were lots of opportunities for both of those leaders to kind of put that visit on a pedestal, and in not so subtle ways indicate that of the two meetings, it was the Putin-Xi visit that was the more important one.
And Andrea, to follow up on what Putin got from this meeting, I think there were about 40 or so agreements signed. And you mentioned that it's very important for Putin to receive political support internationally, particularly given the criticism he's facing at home on Ukraine and the economic challenges that he's facing at home. On Ukraine and economics, do you think Putin actually got something from China that he actually wanted, or Russia got something from China?
No, not necessarily. I mean, I think, Evan was right at the top that it was really low on substance. I think two points I want to make. I think it is interesting, how much emphasis was placed on the educational exchanges, on infrastructure in Russia's Far East and the Arctic. So to me, the visit is a continuation of efforts of both leaders to continue to institutionalize and build the foundations for a more lasting relationship. I think we all recognize that the Putin-Xi relationship is personally very close, and that has been largely a top-down relationship. But in the statements, with all of the emphasis on educational exchanges, the construction of architecture, mentioning the visa-free travel, it does feel to me like the two leaders are trying to build a more durable foundation for those relationships. So that's point one. And then point two, and I didn't say in the Russian reactions, it was not missed in the Russian media that there was no progress on the Power of Siberia agreement. That was something that the papers highlighted. And so that in that sense, I think Putin did come home largely empty-handed. The thing that is surprising to me, I think, is about how many of our expert community has glommed onto that as a sign of the asymmetry in the relationship. But that has been, this Power of Siberia has been a key sticking point in the relationship for a very long time. And yet cooperation has continued apace in many other dimensions of the relationship. So I guess, we know that she holds leverage in the relationship. We know that these two leaders are not in the relationship to do favors for one another, and that she is going to drive the best possible bargain that he can. And I don't think that we should read that as a sign that the relationship is stalled or anything along those lines, because that has been a reality for quite some time in this relationship, and yet cooperation continues in many other important domains and dimensions.
Evan, did you want to jump in on the Power of Siberia II, because you flagged it early on?
Yeah, I want to come in on the sort of broader argument that Andrea made. I think it's worth asking at this moment whether or not we have reached peak Russia-China. I'm genuinely asking the question. I'm not trying to sort of smuggle in an agenda or a statement. But what I see is a relationship of such overwhelming dependence that neither side, the ability for both sides to sort of pretend it doesn't exist seems to be vanishing. And whether you look at the trade relationship, the diplomatic cooperation, if Xi Jinping, for example, goes to Pyongyang soon, which has obviously been an important relationship for Putin and Russia, thus sort of starting to create some space between Russia and North Korea. It just I think it's worth asking the question, if both sides, both Russia and China, can no longer maintain the veneer of interdependence, equality, mutual respect, all of that, are things going to fundamentally change? And maybe it's premature to ask that question, because, as Andrea rightly pointed out, like, Russia's at war, it has a war economy, it knows that it sort of, is the junior partner. But when you look at this visit, it was so circumscribed in so many different ways, and the dependence is just so obvious. So when you look at the trade relationship, even though it's a relatively balanced trade relationship in terms of numbers, when you actually look at the composition of it, Russia only sells natural resources to China, and China sells machinery and industrial goods. Chinese cars, non-EVs, so internal combustion engine cars, which the Chinese are trying to get rid of, basically dominate the market in China. Chinese consumer electronics, whether it's Huawei, ZTE, Xiaomi, etc., all of those consumer electronics, dominate the market. When it comes to automated manufacturing and robotics, Russia only has one option, China. And then when you look at the investment relationship, there's very, very, very little Chinese investment going into Russia. So if you want a sort of indicator of what China really thinks, especially private Chinese companies really think about Russia's long-term future, look at the fact that both the stock and the flow of Chinese private companies, quasi-private companies investing in Russia is so limited. So, that's why I say, given the symbolism, given the fact that there were no big deals, given the fact that the joint statement was relatively narrow and limited relative to other statements that had lots of explicit criticism of the U.S., indirect criticism of the U.S., proposed security cooperation, sort of the full Monty, this joint statement was relatively limited. So that's why I think it's worth asking the question, have we reached a peak in this relationship?
I think it's a great question. And I think my answer would be no. But I do think the answer is probably driven much more by the Chinese calculus. And so maybe Evan and Bonnie, you guys will have a better sense of what the appetite is coming from Beijing, because as you said, Evan, I mean, the dependence is coming from Russia. And I don't think, at least from, so we've kind of established, we understand it's a top-down relationship. And Putin is the key driver in determining the depth and direction of the relationship. And my sense is that Putin is willing to tolerate greater dependence on China as the price of managing the confrontation with the West. I think he thinks it's a necessary adaptation to achieve his ultimate aims and objectives in Ukraine and in the broader confrontation with the West. And I would assume, Putin, as an opportunist, likely calculates that once the war in Ukraine ends, he will be able to pursue some sort of opportunities that would help right-size the relationship, to recover some of the dependence that they've lost in this relationship. I am very reticent to weigh in with you and Bonnie here,
Sure.
But on the China side, though, this is the final point that I want to make is, when you have Xi talking about a return to the law of the jungle, if there is a sense both in Moscow and Beijing that we are moving to a world where might makes right, then these relationships become very important because it better positions both Russia and China to engage in this world of greater competition. It increases military capabilities of both of their countries, and really importantly, it makes them less vulnerable to the United States. And so my sense is that both countries will continue to see great value in their partnership, even in this, even if the asymmetry continues to grow or at least kind of stays the same.
I mean, those are great points. I agree with most of them. I mean, I guess the reason I asked the question is not to suggest that China won't need Russia anymore, but rather the balance of leverage, the balance of influence in the relationship has tipped, and is 2026 the tipping point? So if we live, as Xi Jinping says, in an international system defined by the law of the jungle, then sure, China wants more assets on its balance sheet, and Russia is one of the better assets simply because of its military capability, its nuclear weapons, Putin's unpredictability, its aggressive, assertive foreign policy, all of that. But to the extent that the Chinese can control that through a relationship of dependence, a controllable asset is better than an uncontrollable asset. And so that's why, I think that the sort of question I'm asking is not about whether or not the Chinese want to take Russia off the balance sheet, but whether or not it's shifted from an uncontrolled to a controllable asset that the Chinese can deploy much more readily. And what I see is a relationship of undeniable dependence. So the veneer of equality is gone. You see the Chinese picking and choosing the type of cooperation, and the fact that they continue to resist signing Power of Siberia II, even though they know Putin needs it and the world is in the middle of an energy crisis, right? Because signing Power of Siberia II is sort of making a big long-term bet, given the number of years it would take to just build the infrastructure. So that's why I think it's an interesting time, and perhaps the circumscribed nature of the summit is simply a function of the fact that U.S.-China relations are in a relatively stable place, and Xi Jinping wanted the strategic space to pursue this constructive partnership of strategic stability, and that if the U.S.-China relationship snaps back to something more competitive in a year, that China-Russia would snap back to the good old days of February of 2022. But it's that sort of, it's the fact that there were so many of these unique features of the 2026 summit relative to 2025, which was pretty expansive, and 2022. That's why I just wanted to ask the question, not smuggle in a secret agenda.
I like your secret agendas. But the last point I'll make, I think your observation about kind of China maybe not wanting to rock the boat is a really good one, because if you're Xi Jinping, you're basically watching Putin, who is bogged down in Ukraine and is being seriously degraded, and as you said, gaining all sorts of leverage over Russia. And at the same time, you've got Trump, who's bogged down in the Middle East, expending U.S. munitions and other things. So I think the world probably looks pretty good from Xi Jinping's perspective. And as you said, then it then helps explain the utility of a status quo kind of summit.
Absolutely. I mean, this is about the U.S.-China summit. What struck me about the summit was the symbolism and the imagery around the summit was so carefully choreographed to give this image of the U.S. and China now finally being equal partners, right? So, and of course, that has been the brass ring for China and the U.S.-China relationship for a very, very long time, right? We're now equal partners. Why that's the case is a sort of subject for a separate podcast on the U.S.-China relationship. But ultimately, what the Chinese wanted to broadcast to the world through the U.S.-China summit was that the world is trending toward bipolarity, and China and the United States are major power centers. And so I saw the Putin-Xi visit sort of in the shadow of that sort of careful agenda. But if you're Xi Jinping, having Putin and Trump come to Beijing, in addition to the 20 other leaders. So there's a great piece in the FT earlier this week that sort of counted the number of world leaders that have come, and they said that there were 21, right? And we're barely halfway through 2026. So it's the sense of inevitable centrality of China that I think the Putin Xi visit was sort of part of that broader foreign policy strategy.
So can I jump in on here on the point of the trending towards bipolarity? Because the joint statement did mention obstacles towards multipolarity. And I would imagine Russia probably is not very keen on a trend towards bipolarity where it's just US and China. Andrea, can I bring you in here? Like, what is the view from Russia when it comes to how Russia viewed the most recent Trump-Xi summit, and what does that mean for the Russia-China relationship? Are they worried about that development?
No, I don't think, I mean, at least it's not in Russian official statements. It's not in the Russian media. Again, I think like the overarching kind of reaction to the Xi-Trump summit was that it was totally unsubstantial. So you didn't get any of that kind of concern about bipolarity coming out of the Russian side. I think, generally speaking, at least among the elite around Putin, of course, there's concern about the growing dependence. You hear it in the Russian discourse all around Putin. But again, I think, what Putin himself thinks is an entirely different question, and it's really hard to discern. And I guess my gut and my overarching sense based on Putin's reactions and the steps that he's taken is, he's so focused on Ukraine. That is priority 1 through 5. And again, this growing dependence on China is just the cost of being able to fulfill that aim and objective. And once the war in Ukraine is over, Putin is going to be looking for ways to restore Russia's great power status, whether, we should note, that all of the hybrid warfare that's going on in Europe, that Putin is really looking for pathways to undermine NATO and ensure that Russia remains a great power. And my sense is, once the war in Ukraine ends, and of course it matters greatly how the war in Ukraine ends, but if it ends in a way that's favorable to Russia, that frees up all sorts of Russian resources that the Kremlin will then use to reassert itself as a major world power. So I think it's a proximity. You take care of the most urgent problem. The calculation is that you're going to tolerate the cost for the time being, and we're going to figure out how to deal with this problem later once we have the space and the bandwidth to get back to this. But they're focused on the prize in Ukraine and the confrontation with the West, and they'll figure out this China problem.
And I think, Andrea, I think the Chinese answer to that would be our strategy is to create such a high degree of structural dependence that it's basically irreversible. So the Chinese are using the fact that Putin's at war and he needs this relationship with China to create a relationship that can never go back to sort of interdependence. And, at this particular summit, because it appeared as if Xi Jinping could sort of pick and choose what he was going to do, where he was going to cooperate, what he was going to give Putin, but was so limited substance, very, very strong on symbolism, of course, is exactly that is a key strategy in Chinese statecraft. I once had, when I was working at the NSC, I once had a diplomat from a smaller country in the world say, Evan, China is really good at making small countries feel like big ones. And that phrase always sort of stuck with me as a way to sort of capture an element of Chinese statecraft.
Yeah. And I don't want to suggest that Russia will be able to rectify the imbalance, because I think what you're starting to see, as I've mentioned, these kind of growing criticism, more anxiety among the Russian elite, among Russian military bloggers, is this sense that that Putin has made such a gross miscalculation that actually he's not going to be able to accomplish his aims and objectives in Ukraine, and that now Russia is a junior partner to China, and that's going to be very hard to break that dependence, and that this has all been a huge, massive strategic blunder. And I think that is part of the equation that is driving some of this discontent among the elite and people around Putin.
So can I just play the devil's advocate? So if we saw more economic agreements signed, and if we saw the Power of Siberia II pipeline signed, would that, from your perspective, particularly Evan, would that be less dependence Like I'm just trying to figure out like what could have been agreed to at this meeting or at the Putin and Xi meeting that would have signaled a rectification of the relationship and less dependence on China. Because it almost seems like if there's more agreements, wouldn't that be more like tying the two countries even closer?
Good point, Bonnie. I think it depends on what the terms of Power of Siberia II were, right? And my point was that Xi Jinping, both sides have been talking about Power of Siberia II for like 20 years. And Putin needs it, and Xi has still not agreed to do it, And, I think ultimately if Power of Siberia II was reached, you're right, it would have been it would have put the relationship on a trajectory, I think, of even greater Russian dependence on China. But the point I was trying to make was the fact that Xi Jinping rejected it again, right? When we know Putin really, really wanted it, probably both economically, but also to send, a signal of economic strength to elites back in Russia and to the rest of the world.
And following up on that, a related question of whether Russia is more or less dependent on China relates to whether that is actually a problem for both countries. And what I saw in this joint statement was a continuous emphasis on the United States and in some ways an anti-West sentiment throughout the joint statement. So I did want to ask the two of you, did you, as you look at it from both China's angle and Russia's angle, was there any change in how they viewed or characterized the United States and their positions vis-a-vis the United States in this joint statement compared to prior years in particular?
Well, I know, Evan, you've done a little bit of analysis on the, history of some of these joint statements, so I'll let you chime on that. And I'm going to add a question for you, Evan, which was the Chinese use to talk about addressing the root causes of the war in Ukraine. I don't know if China has used that exact language before. So yes, China has definitely parroted Russian talking points about the origins of the Russia-Ukraine war. But this root causes term is really is obviously a Russian buzzword that it uses, but it's not when they say
it's also, I should say, Andrea, it's very much a Chinese buzzword. I can't tell you the millions of meetings, both outside of government and in government, where the Chinese have talked about the root causes. And the root causes phrase is usually to point to something that the U.S. has done badly. So when I hear that in the context of Russia-Ukraine, usually it refers to NATO expansion, right, and Western imperialism. So that I don't interpret as particularly new or surprising or terribly interesting.
But go on. So I think you had done this analysis on.
So I looked. I compared the different documents going back to 2022, and so there's been joint statements for the past 5 years, so 2022 to 2026, and what's pretty clear is in this particular joint statement, there is plenty of indirect criticism of the United States. There is far less explicit criticism of the United States. So in the past, for example, so let's use 2022 as the baseline, explicit criticism of AUKUS, America's Indo-Pacific strategy, the INF Treaty, the ABM Treaty and missile defense, biolabs and sort of militarization of biological weapons, and European security. So you don't see in this particular joint statement, you don't see that level of explicit criticism of the United States. What you see is a lot of the traditional language about Cold War thinking, multipolarity, proxy wars, alliances, the U.S. having a monopoly on global affairs. So none of that anti-U.S., anti-Western stuff indirectly surprises me. What you don't have in this joint statement relative to others is robust and very specific proposals for security cooperation, joint military exercises, efforts by nuclear states to band together, a space treaty, efforts to counter AUKUS. So you don't have that. You have very generic language about joint exercises and law enforcement activities. So, and then, anything that was like very, very, very specifically targeting the U.S., like, exercises that are meant to counter American power. The kinds of language that was in 2022, the 2022 joint statement and the 2025 joint statement, you see it far, far less and more circumscribed in 2026. So
But
that's
Evan,
why I thought this joint.
didn't they? I mean, they definitely called out U.S. actions in the Middle East. I thought they called out the U.S. kidnapping of the Venezuelan leader, the killing of the supreme leader. I mean, there was some pretty pointed criticism.
Yeah, I think so. Again, these are all qualitative statements. I just found it to be more circumscribed relative to the high watermarks of 2022 and 2025. But I don't believe that China is less critical of the U.S., less concerned about the United States, is somehow reluctant to criticize the U.S. in conjunction with Russia. I just found the joint statement not as fulsome and robust relative to some of the prior ones.
So just following up on that, based off of this joint statement, and looking beyond what we're just seeing specifically only in the statement, are the two of you still relatively optimistic about potential or the future of China-Russia security cooperation or its trajectory? Do you still see, despite the fact that there was no detailed mention of the specific exercise, as Evan mentioned in the statement, that you expect more China-Russia security cooperation moving forward? And with the context that in 2025, we actually saw across the board less China-Russia military exercises.
I think I expect the cooperation to at least continue at current levels, if not kind of grow over time. And I guess part of the explanation as to maybe why the exercises are slowing down is, again, with Russia's kind of engagement in Ukraine, it makes having resources available to do those other things a little bit harder. But so my bottom line is, I think, kind of looking at what Russia and China see with the Trump administration, which has been, the kidnapping of a leader in Venezuela, the killing of the supreme leader, threats to annex Greenland. It is this kind of unhinged U.S. unilateralism, and that, at least from Russia's perspective, that's the stuff of Putin's nightmares, that, having a United States that is willing to topple leaders that it views as unfriendly. And that provides, I think, the incentive for them to maintain cooperation with China. So I expect that security cooperation to continue, and I would expect that China certainly will continue to try to extract all of the lessons learned and battlefield experiences that Russia is gaining in Ukraine at a very minimum. And I think what I worry most about is exactly what Evan is saying, is that as China's leverage grows, it does give China more leverage to try to extract increasingly sophisticated military technologies in those areas remaining, which are shrinking, but where Russia still is better than China on the underwater sea capabilities and some other areas. And the thing that I am concerned about is that cooperation is getting harder and harder to see. I think at least under the Biden administration, you had officials that were willing to kind of shine a light on and publicly call out those areas of cooperation that were concerning for the United States, and that's not happening under the Trump administration. And so some of this cooperation, I think, is going to be harder to track, at least from outside of government.
So I very much agree with Andrea. I thought the multiple points she made were important. As she said at the beginning, this was a status quo summit. Very much agree with that. And so security cooperation will absolutely continue. The question I think we should also ask is, in 2026, will we see security cooperation expand quantitatively and qualitatively? And Andrea's right. It may be in part, it may not expand, in part because Russia needs those resources for war, or it could also be because China doesn't want to do anything to upset the stability in the U.S.-China relationship, which is clearly the watchword, right? If there's one overwhelming conclusion from the summit, is that both sides want stability to buy time. And so it's entirely possible that Russia is just going to make a virtue out of a necessity, which is it doesn't have the resources to expand security cooperation with the U.S. this year or maybe in 2027. But China may not want to do more either, simply because it wants to see if it can extend the current era of stability out to the end of the Trump administration. And so that's why, if that dynamic holds, that's why I ask, are we at a pivot point where the veneer of interdependence and equality starts to fall away, the balance of influence tilts towards Beijing, and we begin to see in very subtle, incremental, careful ways China having greater opportunity to sort of pick and choose, to set the agenda in the China-Russia relationship in a way that puts China very much in the driver's seat. The economic relationship, certainly the diplomatic and the military relationship. And the final point Andrea made is such an important one, which is as the Chinese move into this position of relative influence, because the dependence is so undeniable, will they be able to elicit more and better security cooperation, military technical cooperation from Russia? And because we can't see it, we should all be very, very concerned about what that means for Chinese military capabilities. And in particular, an issue that doesn't come up in China-Russia relations, which is sort of baffling, is the fact that the Chinese nuclear modernization is proceeding apace, right? There was just a series of media reports today about how they're building out the infrastructure around their ground-based ICBMs. So this is obviously an issue that the Russians know very, very well. They have to be concerned about it, because if the Chinese reach parity with both the United States and Russia, that really changes the strategic stability relationship.
So, Evan, really quickly, as you were talking, I went back to check the most recent joint statement. It does mention AUKUS. And one thing that struck me about the joint statement was how long it was. And I was checking the length of the joint statement compared to 2025, and it's significantly longer this year. I wasn't able to compare it to 2024 yet. But my first impression from seeing the joint statement was how long it was, and I know maybe it is, as Andrea mentioned, a status quo statement, but it just really covered almost all aspects of the bilateral relationship. Was that, from your perspective, what is China trying to signal with such a long joint statement that is so comprehensive?
Sometimes, longer is a way to symbolically capture, or sometimes a longer statement is not necessarily a more substantive joint statement, right? And as I pointed out at the beginning, this was a double anniversary. So at a double anniversary, you want the longest joint statement of all the joint statements. I'm just not convinced that it was as substantive as prior ones or as pointed as some of the prior ones, but in particular, the 2022 version.
Okay, so 2 last questions to wrap up this podcast. Really quickly for both of you, looking forward, what would you expect or like to see in the coming year that would be an indicator of China-Russia relations substantively deepening?
So I'll answer it this way, Bonnie. The 2 watch points that I think will tell me about what trajectory we're on are, number 1, does Xi Jinping show up in Pyongyang? What does he try to do with Pyongyang? And if it's an effort, which I believe it probably is, to pull Pyongyang a little bit farther away from Russia, closer to China. Now, I don't know what Beijing's going to give Kim Jong-un to do that. That's about China trying to, peel away, generate some leverage with Pyongyang and peel it away from Russia. So what does that dynamic look like? The other thing I'll watch is Xi Jinping is supposed to come to Washington for a state visit. And so if that happens, after it happens, what do the Chinese do in China-Russia relations to, again, project this image of continuity, strength, equality, etc.? What is it that Beijing and Moscow can possibly do after Xi Jinping shows up in Washington to try to reassure what will inevitably be concerns on the Russian side? And then if Trump and Xi meet again at APEC when China hosts APEC, and at the G20 when the U.S. hosts G20. That raises a whole other series of questions of where is the China-Russia relationship if Putin and Xi have met 4 times in 2026? So those are sort of top of mind for me going forward.
I think those are great. Definitely key points to watch. Just to add, I don't know what's in store for Putin domestically, and with the war in Ukraine, again, things are trending in a more difficult direction for him. And so I'll be curious to see if things get worse for Putin, if she is willing to step in any meaningful way, either with economic concessions to try to alleviate some of the domestic economic challenges that Russia faces, or in other ways that help try to shore up Putin's hold on power. So again, a lot of uncertainty about how that goes, but really watching that situation and whether or not she tries to help his buddy out.
And how would he do that, Andrea? Materially, what would be evidence of that?
I think more beneficial economic deals. I mean, my understanding is that trade has dipped a little bit between the two countries. And so maybe getting some of that trade flowing again on the battlefield in Ukraine. I don't know if there's ways to substantively increase the supply of component parts and other things that Russia is needing to. I mean, they've really increased their production of their ballistic missiles. And so could they substantively increase? Are there things that they could do to creep closer to the, quote unquote, non-lethal line and be willing to provide Russia with things that might help on the battlefield? So I think that there's still things that China, you went from the Russians' perspective, there's still all sorts of things that China could have done more of to help them on the battlefield in Ukraine. And so whether or not Beijing is willing to go any further in support, either on the economic side or on that kind of dual use, getting closer to the lethal aid line, that could be interesting. I mean, if Putin is really in trouble, that's going to create challenges for Xi, who, my understanding is would like to see Putin maintain power. And so kind of watching that dynamic.
Fully agree.
And then the other one is how the two leaders approach Iran. Again, I think the Iranian foreign minister was also in Beijing. Obviously, he didn't meet with Xi, he met with Wang Yi, but right before the Trump and Putin summits, the Iranian foreign minister was there. And so how much, coordination would be probably a strong word, but how complementary are the Russian and Chinese efforts to help Iran through a difficult time? I'll also be paying attention to that.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, the two of you, for taking time to join me today to share your insights. I think we probably could have continued this conversation for another hour, but really appreciate both of you joining me today.
Thanks, Bonnie. Great to be here.
Thanks. Great to be with you, and great discussion, Evan.